Hello, Health Science 3202. Sorry, I get you guys mixed up. This is video 2. This is really more for the September 10th Thursday class because obviously we're going to have two videos and they're both in regard to very similar things. This is going to be legislation and standards associated with protecting people in regard to the legal framework, policies, and procedures for protecting people in the workplace. And the last video really focused on coronavirus. This video is going to focus a little bit more on what's important in regard to occupational settings, how we're going to protect people in an occupational standpoint. And again, I'm not going to read these slides word for word, but I am going to try to hit the high points for you so that you can kind of get an idea of why occupational health and safety practices and policies and procedures are so important. So in 1890, there was legislation on coal miners' health and safety. This was one of those jobs that a lot of people were dying very readily. And the question was, what is killing these individuals? And certainly not having personal protective equipment, being exposed to large amounts of coal dust, this was very dangerous. And obviously there were a lot of other things as well. So in 1970, virtually 80 years later, the Occupational Safety and Health Act was initiated. It was really enacted in 71. It took a little bit of time to get it into play, and that gave birth to the Department of Labor. So very important in regard to this direction upon which we were going to start building the very framework that we start to protect worker health and safety, and that really didn't come into play until about 1970. So OSHA is born based around the act. So you have the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is administered by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So the OSHA Act is administered by OSHA, the governing body for occupational safety and health. And then there's the OSHRC, which is the Review Commission, and then we also have NIOSH as well, which is very important in regard to setting standards when it comes to permissible exposure levels and how much chemical you should be exposed to at any given time within the working environment. NIOSH is very heavy with that. On to slide 26. So again, OSHA created regional and area offices throughout the country. So OSHA has established a number of facilities based on the number of people. Certainly, if you work in a place that has a lot of coal mines, they're going to probably have a lot of OSHA regulators. Their major responsibility is to enforce the act, and they set standards in regard to what people can be exposed to, and then they oversee state plans and employer-employee training. So OSHA does a lot to provide information in regard to how employees should be trained against things like heat stress and exposure to chemicals and a wide variety of things, including working with radioactive materials. On to slide 27. So we talk a little bit about NIOSH. This is an agency within Health and Human Services. It's responsible for developing research and experimental programs to promote understanding and prevention of occupational related diseases. So NIOSH does a lot to really say, okay, how much of this chemical should you be exposed to? And they generate what are called permissible exposure levels, which essentially says that if you work for 8 hours in any given area, you should not be exposed to things like sounds that exceed this amount, or chemicals that that are being absorbed, or you're coming in contact with those over your 8-hour shift. How much should you and can you be exposed to? And NIOSH is really responsible for that. So again, the OSHRC is a regulatory body that essentially will regulate disputes between OSHA and employers. So this is a very important piece that OSHRC is in place, because they're essentially going to be the judge given any disputes between OSHA and employers. On to slide 29. The act itself, what are the objectives of the act? And really it's designed to make sure that people are safe, to provide a healthy working environment, to make sure that the research is appropriately being done so that people aren't being hamstringed by rules and regulations that are not important, but that they focus on things that really are to protect people from diseases, like things like mesothelioma, exposure to asbestos, asbestosis, things like that. But even if if you work in electroplating today, you're going to be exposed to cadmium. If you work where I work in vector control, you're going to be exposed to things like triethylamine. How much can I be exposed to on any given shift? And these are important things, and that's really what the objective of the Act, the Occupational Health and Safety, um, OSHA, the OSHA Act is going to be responsible for. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act. What are its objectives, its core components, and certainly these are important pieces. So on to slide 30. I apologize. This is like my fourth video today, but want these to be good for you. I really want you to have a good understanding of this stuff. So the specific objectives are to have a safe and healthy environment for the workplace, which is absolutely critical, but to look at, identify health and safety related issues and problems, define rights for employers and employees, report accidents, injuries, and fatalities, set and enforce standards and regulations, encourage states to create their own plans that are individual to those states, and certainly they have to have higher standards than the federal standards, make operations cost effective, which is the last step to this. And these are all very important pieces for the specific objectives associated with the Occupational Safety and Health Act. So standards, interim national consensus standards, permanent standards, general standards, emergency temporary standards. These are all going to be what's going to come from OSHA, from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They're going to come up with these standards and they're going to enforce these standards. So the interim standards are pre-existing standards. They come from the American National Standard Institute, which you probably have seen ANSI before, National Fire Prevention Association, Fair Labor Standards. And again, the test questions on these are going to be pretty easy, pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to make these classes so challenging for you that you have a great deal of anxiety before your exams. I want you to do well in this class, but I want you to be able to get a lot out of it too. So hang on to this information and make sure you have an understanding of it. Read the slides, so that way when you see these things, what is ANSI, you have an idea of the fact that they make these interim standards for the OSHA Act, for the OSHA administration to administer. Permanent standards, interim standards are made permanent. New permanent standards can be created with input from affected employers and employees as well, and they're going to generate a lot of conversation in regard to what is most important for these permanent standards. On to slide 34, the general standards. These standards cover hazards that are common in the industry, and obviously with risk assessment, which we'll talk about later, you can identify these standards fairly easily in regard to what the hazards actually are. So obviously you're going to have standards for worker safety in regard to fire prevention. You need to have these standards so that everybody has the right number of fire related devices like smoke detectors and sprinkler heads and fire extinguishers and things like that. These are very important in regard to the general standards. And then emergency standards. So OSHA can make emergency standards based on any given situation when health and safety is in imminent danger. And they're really intended for a limited short-term period. They're not designed to be long-term. So these emergency standards get put in place to handle immediate issues, and they certainly are and can be flexible and at the same time very stringent. So obviously with coronavirus, we really haven't seen a lot of emergency standards that have emerged, but certainly this is something that I think they were hesitant to generate standards based on coronavirus because of the fact that you're going to see a ton of lawsuits come out on this where someone was forced back to work, they got coronavirus, and then they're going to bring litigation against their employers. So on to slide 36, general industry standards. These are Code of Federal Regulation standards. in regard to electronics, machinery, exit standards. How many doors do you need to have, material handling, walking and working surfaces. So these are specific OSHA standards for CFR. Now, there's no way I'm going to test you on these and say what's 1910.35, but obviously if I did test you on that, it'd be pretty easy to do a quick search to find the answer. So not the kind of stuff that I like to test on, but again, I don't want you to memorize these. On to 37, which is a continuation of the standards, hazardous materials, fire protection, things like that. So these are the CFR, and you can definitely find these on the internet, Code of Federal Regulations. If you look for any of these numbers, they're very easy to find online. 38, which is variances, it's going to be allowed due to a lack of technical personnel, structures, and equipment. So temporary variances are going to be for 1 year, which can be extended for 6-month periods, and then permanent variances may be revoked after 6 months by the employer, employees, or OSHA. So variances are going to be small allowances to things like the CFR. Can we make a small variance in association with the fact that we may not have the right structure, we may not have the right flooring in place, and we can make these variances based on needs associated with the employer and the employee with guidance from OSHA. So variances are going to be these small, subtle changes that you can make to these codes to be able to protect workers and work operating employers. On to slide 39, enforcement of standards. So OSHA inspections, I don't know if any of you have ever had an OSHA inspection, but again, something that you generally tend not to see unless there's an occupational hazard that has been uncovered either by the employer or the employee, or through a work-related morbidity or mortality collected data. So if somebody gets hurt or somebody dies on the job, these inspections are going to be handled by OSHA compliance inspectors, and they're just going to come in. They're not going to give you notice on this stuff. They can do regular inspections, which are normal, and they're scheduled for a workplace, but generally OSHA inspections are very kind of surprise. They don't give you any time to prepare for them. So an employer, an employee, or an employee representative may request a special inspection, and certainly they can be followed up with citations as well, which are very costly. An accident with 1 death or 5 hospitalizations has to be reported to the Department of Labor within 48 hours. So that is a critical piece. If you do have one of these events that occurs where you have 1 fatality or 5 hospitalizations, it's required that you report that to the Department of Labor, and that's probably going to trigger an OSHA inspection. On to slide 40. Citations. Citations can be very costly, and non-compliance can definitely create a lot of problems. So what's going to happen is the inspector is going to come out and they're going to give you so much time to fix a citation, and they're going to continue to increase fines that are going to be levied against you through that time period. Certainly the employers do have a right to appeal these citations. With minor violations that have no direct effect on safety and health, a notice is generally issued instead of a citation, so they will notice that you have a minor violation, and that will not carry fines. So with a minor violation, they're basically going to say, hey, you need to fix this, but they're really going to do more documentation than anything. But with imminent danger violations that can cause serious physical injury or harm to health or death, respiratory protection for workers, things like that, these are a lot more serious, and they're generally going to take these very seriously. And these are the things that can result in a direct citation where you're actually going to come out of pocket for these things. So you really want to avoid these at all cost if you're running an organization. On to slide 41, violations. So these can carry very hefty penalties of $10,000. Repeated violations will also carry that $10,000 price tag on them. They're very costly and definitely something that you do not want. With serious violations, they're determined by the inspector for OSHA, and they can carry a fine of $1,000 with like things like compatible storage, flammability with if you put flammable materials with oxidizers, things like that, they can come in and say, okay, we're going to give you $1,000 fine, and they definitely want you to fix those very quickly. With non-serious violations, they can also carry a penalty of up to $1,000, and these are things like bad housekeeping and tripping hazards and things like that. But generally, these are not looked at the same fashion. These are usually going to come off as minor violations, especially when it's housekeeping issues and things like that. On to slide 42. Continuing violations. So if you're not corrected within the time frame set by the Department of Labor, this will carry a penalty of $1,000 per day. So if they tell you to fix something and you don't fix it, they're going to keep coming back day after day after day, and every day you don't fix it, you're going to have a violation of $1,000 a day. So you do that for 20 days, that's a $20,000 fine, which is just going to be a monster, and you're not going to be able to operate until you fix this and pay the fine. So slide 43 is criminal penalties. So obviously OSHA, they take their work very seriously. Willful violations that result in employee death can carry a fine of $10,000 or 6 months in prison, and this is for your first conviction. And then the second conviction is $20,000 or a year in prison. So you see the math here. They're just going to keep doubling it. Filing a false document carries a fine of $10,000 or 6 months in prison, or both. And then assaulting or hampering work of an inspector carries a fine of up to $5,000 or 3 years in prison, or both again. So these are very serious. You do not want criminal penalties associated with the OSHA violation. On to slide 44, records, reporting, and posting. An employer of 11 or more employees has to maintain and provide upon request the logs and summaries, supply records, annual summaries, which are posted usually in February, and also a record of employee exposure to toxic or physical agents. So you do have to keep records, and this is very important, so with regard to posting, you'll always see the OSHA postings that are going to come up right around February 1st, and those will be posted throughout any job site. To make sure that people understand that if there is an issue, that they can contact OSHA. Those numbers are very readily available to individuals, but also that you as an employer have to keep record of employee exposures, essentially the onus is on you to make sure that you're protecting your organization through these records processes. On slide 45, management responsibility under the OSHA Act of 1970. There's a lot that you have to manage as a manager. Occupational injuries have to be logged, diseases, loss control, industrial toxicology. You have to be good at risk assessment, engineering controlled systems, safety, mechanical guards, electrical safety, lots of stuff on here. But if you're a manager and you're working in a management-based setting, whether it's at a fast food restaurant or a hospital, you have to be good at all these different things, and you have to understand the importance of each of them under the OSHA Act of 1970. On to slide 46, occupational safety and health. So the workplace employee safety and health is a serious matter for both the employer and the employee. It's very important that the worker practices safety as best as possible, but that the manager provides a safe and protected place for an individual to work that is within the standards of federal OSHA or state guidelines, like with Cal OSHA here in the state of California. So you want people to be satisfied with their safety at work, and certainly when there are workplace injuries, that there is compensation, certainly with product liability as well. On to slide 47, HAZCOM. This is Hazard Communication Standards. There's a lot going on with HAZCOM, and you certainly have to have a large document that's associated with hazard communication with the facilities that you work, which includes labeling, product labels, safety data sheets, which used to be called MSDSs. Now they're just called SDSs. These are material safety data sheets, or safety data sheets now, SDSs, and they have to be made available to the employees. They need to be able to access these things and understand their exposure at any given facility. So HAZCOM is very, very important. And if you become a manager, you should probably take just a general course on HAZCOM, and read other people's HAZCOM manuals and ask them what they do to make sure that you have everything in place when you actually roll out your own HAZCOM program. But again, you got to understand what the state is requiring you to do, and with California, HAZCOM is very, very important, down to where you're recording everything in your facility that has a safety data sheet associated with it. On to 48, some other regulated legislation. So RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 76, that's cradle to grave coverage of hazardous substances. So when it was made, where it's been, and where its final resting place is. CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980. Superfund, 1986, I think is a little bit more important. This was the Amendments and Reauthorization Act, the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, that basically said that if you were a gross polluter, you're responsible for it and you're going to pay to clean it up. And that was where SARA really hit its stride, was really mostly working with like military bases and large government projects, but also like PCB manufacturers and things like that. But he certainly wanted to know where these toxic substances were, and doing the very best that we could to clean those things up. Certainly if a company is defunct and out of business, it's hard to collect from them, but the federal government's going to step in and use the Superfund Act to clean those areas up. And then in 1986, you had the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, which is very important. In 1986, they basically said that if there is something that spills, or if there is a gas leak or things like that, that you have to let people know what's going on. And that only occurred in 1986. So it was like, oh, we had this accident, let's not talk about it. And now it's much more of a vocal process where people want to know what's going on in their communities. So with slide 49, standards for preventing accidents associated with the CFR again, 1910, Code of Federal Regulations. The frequency of slip and fall accidents is reduced by providing proper railings, which are very important, barriers. The floor should be even, and good housekeeping should be practiced, but very important stuff. You have to have a floor that is safe, and this is a standard for preventing accidents based on the Code of Federal Regulations. And then material handling generates a lot of risks, and certainly moving machinery can as well, and these are important pieces to protect your workers in regard to the Code of Federal Regulations. So this is a codified law that essentially says that you have to protect people from these things. You can't have crazy flooring, unusual tile and things like that that are going to catch your feet where you're going to fall. You can't have risks associated with moving machinery and things like that. On to slide 50. Continuation of standards. Moving parts require guards. Electrical equipment that processes at over 50 volts requires special safety designs. Hazards labeled with warnings. Vibrations minimized for employee comfort. And then onto the NFPA fire standards. Not really very critical, but certainly if you've seen the signs that you have ratings from 0 to 4 in regard to standards, 0 being the least and 4 being the greatest hazard. These are going to be displayed on a diamond with red, blue, and yellow on those diamonds, and white as well for special instructions. The hazard numbers are displayed on the diamonds, so red is for fire hazard, blue is for health hazards, and yellow is reactivated radioactivity hazard, and then white is for site-specific hazards, like you may see an O with a line through it, which means, a W with a line through it, which means that you do not use water if you're a first responder. And then that's very important that these individuals understand that there are specific issues with these locations. So you can see these NFPA standards throughout Cal State San Bernardino. You can see them on the chemistry building. You can see them in most of the places that you will be working, that they'll have these signs and that they will be posted so that people know what the risks are before they enter into that facility. This is really most important for first responders, that they know exactly what's going on. So with that, we're going to close out this lecture, this video. Again, if you have questions, let me know, but make sure you're reading the PowerPoints, that you kind of have an idea of what we're covering. And again, with regard to the tests, they're not going to be exquisitely painful. I'm going to make them as manageable as possible for you. So again, if you have questions, email those questions to me at william.vandyke@csusb.edu. Thanks, and have a wonderful week.